Story 1. As a lawyer, I had a client who was worth $1.2 billion. I was preparing his prenuptial agreement for his young new girlfriend. He seemed like a nice guy. I would not have expected him to be rich at all. Story 2. Met Bruce Willis in his hometown. Bought drinks for all his old classmates and others at a local bar. He was a regular guy around his old friends. Story 3. Shared an elevator with Jeff Bezos and his security officer after the Joker movie in 2019. I did not realize it was him until I got off, and my girlfriend told me who it was. Story 4. Not sure how much, but I used to caddy at a prestigious country club that was impossible to get a membership at. It was called Catanset Country Club in Marion, Massachusetts. Lots of old money hiding out in that little seaside town. Anyway, I always got stuck with this guy named Montgomery. The bare minimum they had to pay for a caddy was $12 for 18 holes, which took about 3.5 hours. He never gave me a penny more than that $12, while other kids were getting $100, $200 tips. One time he asked me if I wanted a hot dog and soda at the 9th hole pit stop. I said, sure, thanks. He took it out of the 12 when he paid me. I just knew that's the type of thing only the ultra-wealthy would do. And his name was Montgomery. Only wealthy people get named Montgomery. Story 5. I'm a senior executive in Silicon Valley and have met a few billionaires. The richest person who would quickly respond to a text is probably worth $500 million. Story 6. I know a man worth approximately $700 million who you would never suspect when seeing him in public. He just looks like a great-grandfather buying fishing lures at Walmart. Story 7. I once had breakfast with the owner of a Major League Baseball team. It was the only time I sat at a table of about 6 people where everyone watched one person pick up the check, and no one even pretended to argue over it. I am okay with you buying me bacon and eggs, and I am pretty sure you are okay with it too. Story 8. My limousine driver Frank is rich in spirit. He is very helpful when I get poisoned by my constituents as well. Story 9. One of my good friends is worth about $50 million, which is very wealthy. He made his fortune building high-performance interconnects for large banks. You can interpret that as you wish. Story 10. A client who owned a huge empire of sand and gravel was a bold individual who broke all the rules. Eventually, he donated $100 million to build a local hospital. Story 11. This man owns a large construction company. He has a private gallery with many interesting items such as rare fossils, minerals, and petrified wood. He also has a significant collection of Roman Byzantine artifacts. He hosts many public events at his gallery, and I think he is a great person. Story 12. Henry Fonda. My mom's cousin is Shirley Fonda, so back in the 1970s we went to visit them at his Bel Air mansion. I was 12 and remember how shocked I was that he was so down to earth. He was tending to his beehives dressed in old blue jeans. We got to swim in his pool, which had a concrete diving platform with 2 concrete lions on both sides. I remember there were amazing chandeliers in every room in the house. Before we left, we all got pictures taken with him. He was just a super nice man. Story 13. Elon Musk. I was in a Tesla store in London looking around. This would have been 2015 to 2016, before he became very well known. He walked over to me, asked how long I had been in the store, and if any staff had spoken to me. We chatted for a couple of minutes about the Model S. Then he went to the staff area in the store. The other staff did not seem to expect him to just walk in through the front door. Story 14. The richest man I ever knew was in citrus farming in South Florida. He was incredibly humble and sometimes seemed embarrassed by his wealth because his father had flaunted it. He was generous in a very quiet way and actively looked for ways to help people. The only signs of his money were that he was on the board of directors of several banks in multiple states and the size of his quietly given gifts. His everyday dress was work boots, cargo shorts, and worn polo shirts. If you asked him what he did, he would tell you he was a farmer. He had a beautiful wife who genuinely loved him and 2 great children. He committed suicide several years ago, and no one knows why. He was a good friend, and I think of him often. If I were ever wealthy, he is what I would aspire to be. Story 15. I used to work at an upscale athletic club in the Seattle area. Bill Gates was a regular. I can't say for certain that I ever met him, but I used to see him around a lot. I taught swim lessons to the children of a few lesser billionaires, but I mostly spoke to their wives and nannies. I hosted a birthday party for one of the Nordstrom children and actually met the father. I think his name was Eric. There was always a lot of technology money around, but they were generally nondescript 50-year-old white men. I only got starstruck when famous athletes showed up. Story 16. The silent partner when Studio 54 got caught avoiding taxes from cash was also part owner of Crazy Eddie's from the 1970s and 1980s. Story 17. Russian oligarch with contacts to unknown individuals. Not sure I even want to know. Let's just say that wealthy Russians are more superstitious than your average horoscope enthusiast. Story 18. I still don't know who he was, but I used to do delivery for Uber Eats. I got this order from a gas station for a burrito or something. When I was going to drop it off, I received a text saying to message when I arrived. It said I would know it by the two lion statues in front. Sure enough, there were two lion statues in front of a large gate. I texted the number back, and the gate started opening. I drove about 30 seconds down a road until I saw a gigantic house, about the size of a Walmart. There was a fountain in front of the house, and off to the side was a private garage with many cars. The strangest thing was who was there. This guy had his entire living room furniture sitting in front of the house. He was using a clearly expensive laptop doing work or something. He was wearing cheap basketball shorts and a plain blue shirt. Super friendly though. I handed him the bag, and he smiled and said thank you. He said the gate would open on the way out. It was an unforgettable experience. He was clearly rich enough to buy whatever he wanted, yet he got a gas station burrito and wore cheap clothes. Yet the house, garage, fountain, and laptop clearly showed he was very wealthy. Yeah, I still wonder who he was. Story 19. I used to work at a rich hotel. I saw wealthy people all the time. I would say the richest was one of the executives at British Petroleum. He was actually really nice. He left behind a $500 pair of Sennheiser noise-canceling headphones. I tried to get a hold of him for 3 months with no reply. I still have them. They sound fantastic. Story 20. I worked for a charity, and we were visited by Melinda Gates. She came to speak to each of us, which I thought was very nice. Story 21. We have a legitimate billionaire in our family. My mother-in-law's sister. They are very greedy and unloving people. However, they live the life you would expect a billionaire to live, with homes in Whistler, San Diego, the south of France, and several other locations. They fly privately everywhere but never invite anyone else in the family. There are about 8 siblings. Story 22. My brother was a male nanny for wealthy families, so I met Liberty Johnson, the heiress of the Johnson & Johnson family. She and her adopted son, William, lived in a 12-story mansion in Manhattan near Central Park. This child was about 9 years old when I met him and had an elevator that went to his room. Story 23. I once fixed Robert Mondavi's wife's internet. She was very nice. She was in a wheelchair at that time and had a caregiver and housekeeper with her. That house is amazing. I have worked in many mansions around California, and this was nicer than any of them. While not huge, it was like a curated museum. From the minute you pull into the driveway, you feel like you are surrounded by something exceptional. The master bedroom was truly impressive. 3/4 of it was round with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Napa Valley. Truly an incredible view. I have probably worked in richer people's houses, but that was the most impressive. Story 24. I used to work for a billionaire. I urinated next to him at the urinals many times. He definitely did not know my name but recognized my face and would say, "Hey, what's up?" We must have had very similar bladder sizes and water consumption. Story 25. I knew a land developer in Maryland in the 1990s. $1 million homes, yachts, expensive cars. He had such severe anxiety that he couldn't park his own yacht one time. He wanted to be a novelist. He couldn't control himself and created a mess of families. I don't know how many wives, exes, and children he had. His wife at the time complained to me, barely scraping by. that she couldn't afford a new fall wardrobe or new fancy shoes and bags because the business was slow. He went to school with my husband, so that's why they associated with less wealthy people. Plus, my husband could park a yacht. Story 26. I had to give a presentation at my work a few weeks ago for Zhong Shanshan, one of China's richest people. He is worth around $60 billion. Story 27. Warren Buffett or Larry Ellison, depending on who was richer at the time. I watched the America's Cup on Larry Ellison's yacht in San Francisco Bay and was allowed to join the adults for the party. I talked to Warren Buffett for quite a while and said hello and congratulations to Larry Ellison. Story 28. A man who donated a large amount of money to the nonprofit organization I work for. He made the money he donated from mint-condition Pokemon cards. He used to be a distributor. He is passionate but quite strange. Story 29. John Saul, worth $6 billion, invented the software JMP that I use daily for statistical analysis. I sat next to him at a JMP conference in Europe. He is still a normal, humble person. I did not realize he was worth that much until a couple of his employees were talking at a bar that night about hoping to ride back to the United States on his private jet. Story 30. I was in the Marine Corps. One of my fellow Marines asked if he could get a 96-hour pass. He wanted to fly to California for his sister's wedding. I told him he might want to take leave. He said he had used all his leave. I couldn't find the platoon sergeant, so I went to the company gunnery sergeant. He and the first sergeant said a pass was only granted with a round-trip airline ticket and a confirmed reservation. I told him what I was told. He gave a sad-eyed look and said, "Dad said he would send the plane." I didn't know how to respond and went back to the company office. I told the first sergeant twice that he wanted to see him, and a phone call was made. Then he left Friday morning and came back Monday afternoon. I guess technically his family was wealthy. Story 31. The richest person is probably Jerry Jones or Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, but the true net worth of sheikhs is never publicly disclosed. I have also met and collaborated with Arnold Schwarzenegger, who is a self-made billionaire. Story 32. Ran into Taylor Swift while leaving a bathroom one time. She is a billionaire now, but this was more than 5 years ago when she was just a multimillionaire. Story 33. Scott Budnick is a movie producer and director. He either made or helped with all the Hangover movies, Project X, and some others. He helps incarcerated people change their ways when they get out. He has his own company called the Anti-Recidivism Coalition. I met him while I was at an inmate fire camp. He would come by often and even helped me get a job at CAL FIRE. He is a really cool person. Story 34. I don't know everyone's net worth these days, but a fairly educated guess is Kevin Smith, writer, director, and actor of the New Jersey Chronicles movies, including Clerks, Chasing Amy, Mallrats, and Dogma. He was doing his question and answer tour around American colleges, and I spoke with him briefly before he talked to my friend on the phone. He is a very relaxed and friendly person. Story 35. My mother's cousin is worth about $500 to $600 million. I only ever meet him at weddings and funerals. She always spoke highly of him, but he did not even bother to come to her funeral. Story 36. Ken Morrison and his family had holidays in the same place. In 2007, the Sunday Times estimated his worth at £1,350 million. I have met Richard Harpin a couple of times. He sold his company for £4,200 million, but I think his stake was about £900 million. I have met a few others with net worth in the £100 to £300 million range. Story 37. I once shook hands with Warren Buffett when my best friend won the Alice Buffett Award for Outstanding Educator and took me as his guest to the banquet. Story 38. It depends on whether you count everything being paid off. My grandfather has everything paid off after being fired from a really good job where he worked for at least 20 years. My uncle easily makes more in a year than anyone else in the entire family, but he attempts to live as if he has $600,000 per year when he is actually making $300,000 per year. Everything will be repossessed when he eventually loses his job. Story 39. I have been on a first-name basis with 2 billionaires at different times in my life. Trip Hawkins throws an exceptional party. Story 40. Founder and owner of Intro Real Estate, Gino Blafari. He sold the affiliates to Berkshire Hathaway for approximately $50 million and went on to run Berkshire Real Estate. Essentially, Warren Buffett was buying him as a leader. Very nice guy, really inspiring, and always remembered everyone's name, no matter where they were under his leadership. If there is ever someone who deserves to be wealthy based on betting on himself, the way he treated everyone around him, and the talent he attracted, it is him. Very open about his faith, thought processes, and what he did to get where he was, and I feel fortunate to have worked with him during that time. Story 41. I spent some time with Vince McMahon. I'm built as if I have a week to live, but I joked that I was really tough because I managed to beat up Fat Damon, the school bully, when I was 12. On the strength of that, he said I could come wrestle for him. I think a man of his standing should know that this constitutes a legally binding job offer as a wrestler, so I mentioned that fact during icebreakers before revealing the less glamorous truth. Shaking hands with the Big Show, by the way, is like shaking hands with a head. Story 42. I drove a tow truck in northern San Diego County in the 1980s and 1990s and met many ball players. Bip Roberts, Tony Gwynn, Raleigh Fingers, Randy Jones, Gary Templeton. His wife was such a doll. However, I think the richest person was an unknown man who had me flatbed a new Corvette from the dealer to his home garage. When I arrived, his garage was large enough for me to pull inside and unload, about 80 feet by 120 feet. He had his cars parked at an angle down both sides. The first things to catch my eye were 3 Ford GT40s, a Lamborghini Countach, and several Ferraris. He easily had 50 cars of the same class in there. Story 43. I ran into a former client who was a hotelier at the time, at a concert a few months after he sold the rights to his mobile game for $600 million. Story 44. A man in my high school class had a high-level Wall Street job and, when he left, was worth $235 million. Story 45. After our train broke down, I once shared and paid for a 1-hour taxi ride with a Pakistani man who I later learned was a billionaire industrialist. He gave me his number and invited me to visit, but after discovering he was a billionaire, I chickened out of calling him. I regret that. Story 46. I met a man who owned the majority of the concession rights at Atlanta Airport. We were on a hunting trip in Wyoming. He said he made more money during the trip than the trip cost him. Story 47. As a child, nobody in my family ever told me who they called me down to shake hands with was rich or not. While working in the information technology department of a bank in my early 20s, I met a few wealthy people who are not widely known, so I will not mention them. Let me tell you this, you have met people 10 times as wealthy as the richest people you thought were rich. Most wealthy people cut out coupons from the newspaper and live like a typical middle-income family. The extravagant ones with designer clothes are either mocked or ignored. That is my experience. Story 48. My ex-stepfather ran and continues to run many food companies. He manages operations and is heavily involved in administration and ownership. When he and my mom were together, he was making about $250,000 to $300,000 a year. Now, according to my mom, his income is closer to $1 million. We lived in a nice house in an expensive coastal city, went on many vacations, and had nice cars. They even bought my little sister Gucci tennis shoes. I'm not sure I will ever be around that kind of money again. Story 49. Bernard Arnault. I met him accidentally, and everyone I have ever met who has met him says he is kind of unpleasant. I cannot say for sure myself. It is just what I have heard. He did not treat me badly or anything. I just happened to ask someone a question while he was talking, and it was more like, "Who is that guy?" Then they introduced me. Story 50. The old man I am renting a house from in Switzerland drives an old Citroën with mismatched panels. He owns nearly half the Swiss village and is building 2 new apartment complexes nearby. He does not have a management company. For any issues, I just have to call him directly. Next to him is my boss, who goes sailing spontaneously and bought during the market dip in 2008 with an investment of several $100,000 Swiss francs. He has not withdrawn any funds yet, but has added a few extra investments over the years. He dresses very casually, does not own a car, rides a bicycle, and most often takes the train. Story 51. Dan Snyder, when he owned the former Washington Redskins, brought Bruce Allen with him to a local strip of bars. They were insufferable and tipped only 10%. Story 52. I worked at a high-end steakhouse. A Saudi sheikh and his entourage of 12 wives, bodyguards, and attendants bought out the restaurant after hours for a meal. It was surreal. I watched a man open the wine list, then run his finger through the entire list until he reached the highest price. He ordered about 8 bottles of Chateau Petrus at around $1,600 each, just to get started. Wild. I worked at another restaurant that catered to the man who, at that time, owned all of Budweiser's distribution for the southeastern United States. He was very wealthy, with a strong traditional demeanor, and quite irritable. Story 53. I am not sure, but he was bragging about how he lost $3 million already while sitting down to play blackjack in Las Vegas. Then, he bought expensive champagne for everyone at the table, and I really wanted to ask if he would rather pay off my student loans instead. Story 54. There is an old man and woman in town who are worth over $300 million. I work on their air conditioners occasionally. His family owned large sawmills in the early 1900s and supplied most of the lumber for the armed forces during World War II. She inherited several oil wells that were not producing much until they found a better way to extract oil, and they have been earning money from them for at least the last 20 years. These people are in their 80s. She enjoys having yard sales, and he has to keep an eye on her so she does not sell any of his clothes. One time, I had to check on something, and they had just returned from a doctor's appointment in a city 60 miles away. He said, "Come here, let me show you something." He opened the refrigerator door and pulled out a to-go container. Inside was a large, half-eaten loaded baked potato. I looked at it, and he said, "Guess where I got it?" I said, "I have no clue." Then he described a small restaurant on the way to the doctor's office that makes the potatoes. They always stop there and split a potato in half at the restaurant, then eat the other half for supper. I ran into them at a casino once, so I guess they were not as frugal as I had assumed from the potato story. I just thought it was odd of him to show me that potato. Story 55. John C. May, Chief Executive Officer of John Deere, usually walks past me in the office on Tuesday mornings. I am barely awake at that time but usually wave and say good morning. Story 56. A decade ago, I was studying in Ireland. On a random night, one of my friends and I decided to grab beers at a pub in the northern half of Dublin. We sat down, grabbed a pint, and chatted about whatever. About half an hour later, a group walked in. We thought nothing of it until we got up to order another round. "Lads, all your drinks are paid for tonight," I was told. I thought it was odd but didn't mind. Then came a man who looked like a caricature of a Saudi prince, and one of his group announced his name and assured everyone that the drinks would flow. One of them came over to us and asked why we were still drinking Guinness instead of having something better. I like Guinness and didn't want to ruin the hospitality by being greedy. My friend jumped up and ran to the bar, and I didn't see him for the rest of the night. A minute later, the prince walked over and basically said, "Quit drinking poor people's alcohol." I thanked him but said, "This is fine for me." He didn't approve and gestured for a briefcase. There I was, sitting like the idiots in the steakhouse scene when the fake military guys protect the steak in the suitcase while the idiot opens it repeatedly. "Have a drink with me?" he said as someone took out 2 pristine whiskey glasses and poured something that appeared to be whiskey into them. I only speak English and couldn't read the label. So there I was, hanging out with a guy who just handed me a drink worth my entire net worth and told me to drink it. 5 minutes later, he got up and told me to enjoy the top shelf and not feel guilty before going to another table. The next day, I asked my friend if he knew the guy's name. He just looked at me and said, "Dude, free drinks." I accepted that he didn't know or care why it happened. Story 57. I used to work at a very prestigious hotel in New York City. We had a guest who paid to have the toilets replaced in his suite every time he visited. He had a lot of money. Story 58. Not me, but my friend met Donald Trump in a casino in Las Vegas 45 years ago. However, it is uncertain if he was wealthy at that time. It might have been during one of his bankruptcy periods. Story 59. I work for a privately held company that employs about 20,000 people. I have met most of the family who owns it, including the chairman of the board. I have no idea what their collective net worth is, but it is in the billions. Story 60. My sister's husband comes from old money, inherited from his father's company. It makes it difficult not to compare our lives. For the record, my wife and I have successful careers and enough money for life and hobbies. However, we are one generation behind the wealth they have at their disposal. Story 61. Two richest. The owner of both a National Football League team and a National Basketball Association team, and a founder of a technology company. Both are billionaires. Met a retired National Football League quarterback and a Wimbledon champion yesterday. Story 62. Mitzi Perdue. It is probable you have never heard of her. She was married to Frank Perdue, the man from the Perdue chicken commercials in the 1980s and 1990s. I knew she was wealthy because of that marriage, but I recently learned that she is also an heir to the Sheraton Hotel fortune. She is worth about $22 billion. She was an active supporter of a nonprofit organization I worked for about 10 years ago. I met her several times in the office and during fundraisers. She is an incredibly nice and down-to-earth person, and except for dressing quite well, you would never expect she was so wealthy. Story 63. I know a man whose net worth is $14.6 billion from his family's engineering, construction, and project management company. Story 64. Afterman. The fact that he was performing at a cannabis store in a small city in Canada makes me question his recent financial decisions. It was a pretty cool concert, though. Story 65. Met Jimmy Iovine, who is Dr. Dre's Beats by Dre partner, in Las Vegas at a pool party years ago. He was pretty chill. I imagine Charlie Sheen, who was awesome, might have more money. Served Tom Hanks once, but I'm not sure who takes the cake. Charlie is the coolest by far. Story 66. When I was younger and a little bit nerdier than I am now, I sneaked into Elstree Studios while they were filming pickup scenes for Attack of the Clones. At one point, George Lucas walked past me with a whole entourage in tow. This was, of course, before he became significantly wealthier after selling Star Wars to Disney. Although the above may be stretching the definition of met, the next in line would be meeting Shirley Manson, Butch Vig, and the other members of Garbage on various occasions, as they are my favorite band by far. Story 67. 2 words. Indoor pool. It also sucked. The entire house reeked of chlorine. You could not walk anywhere dry. The middle of the entire house was taken up by water. The second floor was just a balcony reaching around, so it did not cover the pool. The humidity was so uncomfortable that I cannot imagine actually living there. They also had a pool right out back. Story 68. I worked for the family that sold Judge Judith Sheindlin's Florida house to her. It was a gated community with about 10 to 12 rooms and 10 to 12 bathrooms. They were on the last Concorde flight. The mother, for whom I worked through her daughter, was one of the kindest, down-to-earth, sweet women I had ever met. The husband was a difficult person. The daughter was also very nice and intelligent but married an unkind man. Patterns. Story 69. I was once working a Little League baseball tournament, and the owner of the local soda distributor dropped off free soda for the volunteers. It was, and still is, a nice gesture. We lived in a small city. Turns out he is worth hundreds of millions. The story goes that he was offered the distribution rights for the region way back in the 1970s and 1980s, with exclusivity forever. Apparently, they tried to sue to get the rights back after the area boomed, but to no avail. He always did delivery himself and just hired others to run the business. A super nice guy. Story 70. I started a job in a pawn shop in the mid-2000s. A couple of years later, the owners were bought out. The new owner was a very wealthy accountant. He gave us a collection of expensive watches to sell, including watches worth £9,000 from his personal collection. We had a charity fund for children with cancer, and people would donate spare change. One day, he came in and put £100 in cash into it. We heard that one year he rented Simon Cowell's private island for Christmas for himself and a group of friends. It turned out that he was the mastermind behind a now infamous tax scam involving many famous people. He eventually declared bankruptcy, but you know how that typically works with wealthy individuals. I am about 90% sure he only bought the business for money laundering or tax evasion purposes. Story 71. Chris Klein was a coal baron with operations in West Virginia. My uncle was a superintendent at one of his mines. He hired me one summer to fill in for the security personnel who went on vacation. I parked at the bottom of the mountain and stopped vehicles going up to the mines. I had specific instructions not to stop his vehicle, but he was pretty cool and stopped on his own accord to chat with me. He bragged to my uncle once that his yacht was moored at the same place as Tiger Woods' yacht. His was supposedly bigger than Tiger Woods. It was kind of gross, but I met the man. Story 72. At an airport, my father recognized and approached an old colleague and his wife. We were introduced. They were just the nicest older couple you could ever imagine. As they walked away, my father patted me on the shoulder and said, "Congratulations, you just shook hands with your first billionaire." Story 73. I am friends with an ultra-high net worth individual in the $250 to $500 million range. He is old school money with a well-known family name. I went to a party at his house and was introduced to an old family money name from Europe. The man was worth over $10 billion, a very interesting person who did not look down on anyone and really only wanted to discuss Champions League football, which was fun. Story 74. My friend's dad was the most unassuming guy you could ever meet. He wore clothes until they fell apart, was a regular at the local bars, collected and hoarded junk, and was generally a well-liked smartass around town. He served in the army, saw the world, and if you bought him an old mill, he would get you drunk the whole night. He also heavily invested in the stock market, particularly Google, Facebook, and Apple, along with many other startups early on. After he passed, my friend didn't have to work. He just lives off dividends and plays PC games. He sold most of the rental properties because he didn't want to deal with tenants anymore. Yeah, my friend's dad was probably the richest person I had no idea was actually filthy rich. Story 75. David Beckham was at a local golf course. I was just walking across it and he was visiting friends, including Gordon Ramsay. He was walking his dogs and I happened to cross paths with him. We exchanged greetings and carried on. Story 76. Working for Twitter, I was in meetings with Jack Dorsey several times. I was also in the room when Dmitry Medvedev, Vladimir Putin's puppet president during his term-limited hiatus, visited the office. I am guessing he is far wealthier than most Silicon Valley leaders. Story 77. My realtor kept saying we should hang on his boat and do some fishing for the last few months. Finally, the day arrived a few weeks ago when the temperatures were at their peak on the East Coast. Being myself, I put on a good amount of sunblock on my face, hands, and neck. I grabbed a hat and my sunglasses and went to the dock where he had asked to meet. I showed up, and it was a 100-foot yacht with rooms, a kitchen, a bar, and air conditioning in every room. I have never felt so poor in my life. Story 78. I met Ian Glenn while walking in Dulwich Village 3 years ago. I am pretty sure he is the richest person I have ever personally spoken to. He was a really nice person. I had a conversation with him about how it was a shame about the last season and took a photo with him. I posted it to the Game of Thrones community, and it was the highlight of my year to receive all that positive recognition. Story 79. I grew up with John Smoltz's son and have been to his house. A distant family member was married to Kate Hudson, whom I met a few times in the 2000s. I have served coffee to Alex Rodriguez, Brian Jordan, and John Rocker as a barista. I have also stood in line to the bathroom with Usher. That is probably about $500 million in net worth if you add them all up. Story 80. Casper Van Dien, Ernie Hudson, David Yost, and Mindy Sterling were all present at the same time. I was lucky enough to run a panel at a comic convention in the Midwest. They were all very cool and not the slightest bit arrogant. Story 81. I had great parents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. I have been married for 38 years, with 2 wonderful children and 3 grandchildren, with more to come. I have great friends. I am still in decent health. How much richer can anyone be? Story 82. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. I worked for Apple right after they started production. Talked with them daily. Story 83. a piece of trash dictator in a Middle Eastern country. Absolute trash, did not respect them at all. The only trait that superseded all was pure narcissism. She treated her guards and security like trash. Story 84. A Buddhist monk in a temple in Nepal had been a monk for the past 25 years. An incredible person. He was obviously not wealthy in terms of money. He was rich in happiness, which I consider more important. Story 85. A man who started one of the early medical cannabis companies sold it after recreational legalization and now has a well-known brand where I live. Story 86. I think of Georgy Grechko. He was a famous person and involved in business. Among people whose net worth I know with some level of certainty, my wife's brother has $2 to $3 million. But I am almost sure Grechko was wealthier. Story 87. Jamie Mawson is a noted Mexican media personality and promoter of unidentified flying objects and supplements. He was a business partner of a family member. He spent the evening drinking tequila and passing around what he claimed were priceless authentic ancient Olmec, Aztec, and Toltec relics, including a large solid jade jaguar skull. Story 88. Todd Wanek, owner of Ashley Furniture and worth over $4 billion, tours the factories often. I was an employee for a few years. Story 89. I have a client at my work who sold his national motel chain at about 75 years old. He comes in and buys expensive vehicles all the time. He said, I have about 10 to 15 years left, and I intend on spending all the money I worked my whole life for. He is very nice, and also, what a flex. His wife passed away, and his kids received their share, so he wants to die with nothing in his accounts. Story 90. I used to sell Range Rovers. I sold a couple to a man who owned the mortgage company. I also have a cousin who is friends with a sheik in the United Arab Emirates. I met him one time. He is a nice man. Story 91. A man who owned a clinical software company with a large contract involving many hospitals worldwide. At the time, he was likely a single-digit millionaire, but this deal probably made him close to a three-digit millionaire. He was a nice person, to be honest. He invited us to a local event and treated us to dinner and drinks. I have never been persuaded like that before or since in my job. Story 92. Kirk Kerkorian. In the early 1990s, I was at a benefit at the Beverly Hills Hotel. He was with a small group of people. He was a warm, welcoming man and maintained great eye contact. He was one of those people you could say. He made you feel like you were the only person in the room he was interested in talking to. Story 93. I went to elementary school with Warren Buffett. I also married into a family with a very wealthy self-made uncle, who was close to billionaire status. Story 94. I dated a girl in New Orleans whose father was a lawyer in New York. He had a multi-story apartment in Manhattan with a real Ming vase in the foyer. Story 95. Former Chief Minister of Sarawak Taib Mahmood and former Prime Minister of Malaysia Mahathir Mohamad. I saw them at events. Both are billionaires as they reportedly embezzled large amounts of money while in power. Mahathir for at least 2 decades as Prime Minister and Taib for 3 decades as Chief Minister. No one else comes close to their wealth. Mahathir was known as the King of the West and Taib as the King of the East. Story 96. A banker worth around $400 million at the time. He is now probably closer to the billion-dollar mark due to his very impressive art collection. He came to a gallery where I was working with a girl whom I assumed was his daughter until she was introduced as his girlfriend. He wore iron jeans and a classic white shirt with a V-neck jumper. Totally ordinary, but the cowboy boots with spurs were an unexpected twist. He was fine, neither rude nor friendly. He spoke to a few artists whom he was a patron of, engaging in small talk and chit-chat. Story 97. I met Catherine Blanchett and Steven Soderbergh at the same time. I am not sure which of the two was worth more money, but I guess they are both quite wealthy. Story 98. I work in nonprofit. I have met one of our wealthier donors and watched him arrive at our fundraiser, purchase $300,000 in auction items, including a car, and then donate everything back. In the following months, he also donated multiple buildings. Unbelievable. Story 99. A lot of wealthy people do not necessarily share their financial status. I knew a friend and her husband who had considerable wealth, with the husband working in technology. Once, I forgot her house number and searched for her online. Searching for Jane Rich Friend produced many results from local charities and a university thanking John and Jane Rich Friend for donations between $50,000 and $90,000. Story 100. Old girlfriend's father was a railroad baron of sorts in South America. Their railroad infrastructure developed later than in the United States. I never tried to estimate his wealth, but it was enormous, probably a few $billions. He and the family were quite humble about it, but there were some excellent perks to dating her for a few years. Story 101. Funny story. I didn't know who he was at the time, but met a very popular male adult film actor called James Dean about 10 years ago. He asked me for a lighter. We talked for about 10 minutes. Nice guy. After looking him up, it made a lot of sense why he had 3 beautiful women sitting with him. Story 102. His name was John Brown. He was my father's friend when I was a kid. He had a giant house, an original Shelby AC Cobra, and a Class 3 machine gun shop just for fun. Story 103. Not really certain, but I was chatting with Tom Holland the other day, met Matt Smith a few weeks ago, and also been to Carol Voderman's house where I met Jude Law. I would guess they are successful, but maybe the owner of a company I subcontracted for a while ago is richer. That person was very wealthy with a Jaguar, Lamborghini, and Ferrari, one for each day of the week. Story 104. The man I met had a fleet of 25 various kinds of airplanes. I do not know how rich he was, but he did offer me a Jaguar if I went on a date with him. I declined because I was married. In hindsight, I should have left my terrible husband and taken the car. Story 105. Dick Yangling, the owner of the brewery, is an acquaintance of mine. He is a billionaire, but he drives a Toyota Camry. It is common to see him at a gas station or in the grocery store. He still shows up to work every day and unloads trucks. Story 106. I have met many professional athletes and a few members of the Saudi royal family, so I imagine the royal family members stand out by a large margin. Some of the athletes include Josh Cribbs, Darnell Dinkins, Odell Beckham Jr., LeBron James, and all of the Seattle Mariners players from 2002 through 2005. I met the royal family members when they got off their private jet at a fixed-base operator near the Cleveland Clinic. Story 107. I have met several people in my business and while hanging around where I live in South Florida. I saw Bill Gates at a bar in Boca. I had nothing to say to him, so we just ate our lunch in peace. To be honest, I am glad he did not recognize me and ask for an autograph. I was in no mood. Story 108. I sent a project message to Larry Ellison and his ex-wife Melanie in the mid-2000s. I got to know both of them fairly well. Story 109. It is difficult to say because I do not usually ask people about their net worth. However, I once sold a $20 million horse farm for a man who lived across the street from his castle. So, I am going to estimate his worth. Story 110. I think Steve Martin is probably the richest. I used to valet cars in a nice part of town where I live. I parked many rich people's cars, usually athletes or local lawyers. Martin was in town for a banjo performance on a quiet Sunday, and he was just walking around by himself wearing a fedora. I was at my booth and spoke to him briefly, doing the usual when it's quiet, and asked how he was doing. He was very pleasant. Story 111. I work in the automotive industry. Many dealer group owners are extremely wealthy, but meeting Rick Hendrick was quite an experience. He gave me a tour of his car museum, which easily contains a couple of $1 billion worth of cars on display. That is not even close to his entire collection. Story 112. Billionaire man who lives across the street from my uncle. He made his fortune with rehabilitation centers all over the country. Retired now in a modest home, he gives everything away to charities. Story 113. This man I met at a cocktail technology mixer while I was living in Silicon Valley was a liquidator for old technology within Fortune 500 companies in Silicon Valley. He casually said his company netted $24 billion the following year. He did not even look wealthy, just an average-looking man wearing Crocs. It checks out because I researched him and his company later, and he was accurate. He was a very nice person as well. Story 114. When I was a journalist, I met Danny DeVito on a press junket for the film Other People's Money. He tried to be funny but came off as crass and insulting toward my state, where the film was partially shot. Gregory Peck was at the same press conference, and I can confidently say I have never encountered another human being with as much quiet class, effortless charisma, and absolute handsomeness as that man. I'm the farthest thing from gay, but hello, sailor. Story 115. Ben Stein. My aunt and I befriended him at the airport, and we still have dinner sometimes. Definitely an odd guy. Story 116. I met Betsy DeVos. She toured our college, and I was one of the faculty delegates selected to meet her. I was with a group of honors students. She said maybe 5 words to me in total and looked through everyone as if they were not worth considering. She did not ask me any questions about teaching or my experience. She did not say much to the students either. They all shared their experiences. She only showed interest in the homeschooled student and asked him about half a dozen questions. She was the coldest person I have ever met. Story 117. Oh God. I don't know. Steven Schwartzman? Does the future king of Qatar count? Steve Cohen? Probably Bill Gates, but he had less money then. Story 118. Met as in talked briefly and had something signed, or met as in I had a conversation with this person that lasted more than 2 minutes. Story 119. Hard to tell. I have met some owners of hotel chains, massive businesses, at least one Russian oligarch, a world-renowned professional driver, and so on. So hard to tell. Story 120. He was involved in real estate and also did a lot of local charity work. Unfortunately, he passed away recently. Story 121. A couple of decades ago, I met the chief executive officer of Progressive Insurance. I think he was quite wealthy. Story 122. I met several members of the United Arab Emirates royal family. A distant runner-up was my uncle who came from Ireland in the 1930s. He was a small-time thief. He earned his business degree, invented prefabricated windows, became chief executive officer of Xerox, started a Mary Kay-style business scheme, co-owned the Dallas Mavericks in the mid-1980s, and owned a private jet. He took us to a game where we sat courtside. He lived a good life and died in his 90s about 5 years ago. Story 123. Probably a technology executive. I have been to many conventions for original equipment manufacturers. I could not say how wealthy any of them were. What difference does another person in a technology t-shirt make? Story 124. Millionaire. Kept it low-key though. Drove a Toyota Camry. Picked me up for our weekly group meetings. All-around good guy. Story 125. I honestly do not know. Most of the billionaires I have met or worked with are very discreet. Story 126. I dated a girl in high school whose family owned a chain of department stores. Their house looked like a funeral home. What sticks with me is that the bedroom doors were wallpapered so they blended in with the walls like in Dynasty or Dallas. I had never seen that before. Story 127. Met and had a lengthy conversation with Tim Berners-Lee at a workshop once. Not sure how wealthy he actually is. I also sat next to the Danish Prime Minister on a plane once. I guess he was quite wealthy. Other than that, probably the former chief executive officer of the company I work at. Had a meeting or two with him. There are not that many ultra-wealthy people in my country. I did meet the son of the Lego chief executive officer at a festival though. Story 128. I was a massage therapist in California for over 30 years. I worked on a man who was the house manager for a well-known couple. They had an apartment in New York, a house in New England, a place in Florida, and a large house in Pebble Beach where I gave them massages. Each property had staff, including a cook, a manager, and an assistant. The wife had been on television and written a book. The husband made his money in mineral mining. They had 2 Labrador retrievers. Story 129. Dan Duncan of Houston, Texas, before he passed away 15 years ago, was worth about $10 billion. I have also met Kelsey Warren. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.